Hello and welcome to Strap Asia's fourth segment of panel discussion on Russia and Ukraine war. Today we will be discussing the implications of this conflict on the future of global politics and how regional alliances are evolving. To discuss these issues, we have a panel of experts. First, Dr. Naeem Salik, who is Executive Director, Strategic Vision Institute, Islamabad, and Ms. Aiza Azam, who is a lecturer at the Air University, Islamabad. Sir Salik, let's start from you. How do you see this conflict, where it is heading and how it is evolving?
As far as this conflict is concerned, at the moment there is no immediate end in sight. Neither is there an initiative being taken to come to a negotiated resolution of the problem. The nature of the conflict has been that it has been a limited war. And problem with all limited wars is that war termination is the biggest problem. When do you declare victory and then call off the operation? Because the other side is not totally defeated. And they might like to continue and try to retrieve whatever they had lost. So from that point of view, I think such kind of conflicts where it's a limited war and also the intensity of operations is also rather modest. It's not a very high intensity conflict, and because of that, chances of such conflicts lingering on for a longer period of time continues. Secondly, the advantages Russians had over Ukraine, they could have prevailed because it's a war of attrition. And in war of attrition, the stronger side in the longer run tends to prevail. But the way Ukraine has been supplied with a continuous flow of latest arms and equipment by the US and the Western allies, it has kept Ukraine fighting and staying in the war. And because of that international support at their back, it has also hardened their resolve to continue to resist. Now it's very difficult for Russia to call off the operation and saying that we have achieved whatever objectives we had set about to achieve, and now we call it off. But then they can't ask Ukraine not to make an attempt to retrieve the areas they have lost. So unless there is a negotiated settlement, which doesn't appear to be in sight, particularly the way the things are developing, I think we are in for a long drawn out conflict.
Definitely, as we see from the international development, and we also saw President Zelensky visiting United States, I think there is more momentum from the West to provide more support. But just asking Ms. Aiza what Dr. Salik said about limited war. Do you consider it's a limited war? Because what we see physically, yes, NATO forces are not involved, but in terms of material, there are a number of countries that are involved in this conflict. So, how do you assess this conflict?
I think I would agree with Dr. Salik that it is a limited war, and particularly if you look at it from the point of view of the Russians, they have yet to unleash their full military force on Ukraine because the objective is not to destroy Ukraine. There are political objectives that they're looking towards. If we also look at it in terms of the allies that are supporting Ukraine, the Western countries, they continue to supply them with arms and equipment and also financial and other forms of aid. But at the same time, they are choosing actively not to get involved directly in the conflict. Going back to your original question about how long this war would continue and what seems, I would again agree with Dr. Salik. I don't think that at present the end appears to be in sight. If we look at, for instance, Zelensky's recent visit to the US, he was just there. I think he has now returned yesterday. Yeah. He was in the United States, and the objective was to get further aid from the United States. President Biden promised an additional $1.8 billion of aid to Ukraine. This is in addition to the aid that they have already provided and have pledged further ahead as well. And then they've also secured the Patriot missiles. And on the other hand, if you see that a couple of days ago, President Putin, he addressed the government and he announced that they would be providing all the support and all the means that is required by the Russian army in order to secure their objectives in Ukraine. And at the same time, they're also now talking about installing additional units in Western Russia in order to counter Finland and Sweden's joining NATO. So what it appears is that even though a negotiated settlement, there might be pressure for a negotiated settlement, but for all intents and means, the way that everybody is continuing to contribute towards it, the way things are going, with this trajectory, at this point, an end in sight is not very likely.
Thank you. We know President Zelensky, his visit, it was significant in terms of military aid, but most prominent was the commitment to provide Patriot air defense batteries by the United States. How do you see this specific Patriot missile system playing in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and how effective would be, and keeping into consideration the fact that Russia also has similar kind of advantage in terms of surface-to-air missiles, S-400s, S-300s?
I think as far as Patriot is concerned, this would constitute a major provocation and a major escalation in the conflict, because there is a qualitative improvement in the weapon systems in the hands of the Ukrainians. But going by the performance of Patriot in the Gulf War in 1991, although such batteries were provided to Israel as well as Saudi Arabia, most of the Iraqi missiles which failed to reach their target, they actually broke up in the air then because of the weak airframes rather than being shot down by the Patriots. And the serious analysis by the experts indicated that performance of Patriot was a dismal failure in that conflict. But it has a symbolic value. This is one weapon system which is very selectively given to countries around the world, and I'm sure since the Gulf War they would have improved the technical capabilities of the system. How far it will be successful, because if you look at the results of the ballistic missile interception tests in the United States, the success rate has not been more than 50% in controlled environments. And these kind of missile interceptor systems can be defeated with various easy solutions which are available off the shelf, and they are quite cheap. So I am sure Russians will find some way around these. And but second related aspect to it is that this will lead them to use more of cruise missiles than the ballistic missiles. Definitely Patriot is a very capable anti-aircraft system, so the intervention of Russian Air Force will be restricted as long as Patriots are there. But they have also announced that they will see Patriot batteries as the legitimate target, and they are going to target them. So what happens if one or two of these batteries are hit by the Russians and destroyed? Would that lead to further escalation, or would that dampen this enthusiasm to give more and more advanced systems to Ukraine?
Thank you. I agree. I think Patriot performance during the Gulf War was questionable, but these are advanced form. These are PAC-3, which are being probably provided to Ukraine. It would be interesting how the Russians, they react to this development, because it is going to escalate. They will come up with the countermeasures. Ms. Aiza, coming back to you, we talked about the Russian objectives and its failure to achieve its political objectives. How do you see Ukraine? Are they achieving their objective? They seem to be achieving their objectives, and how they would want this conflict to end. What's your take on this?
I think if you look at it from Ukraine's point of view, so they would also be looking towards a negotiated settlement, because Zelensky has already indicated this earlier at one point. In fact, there was also talk that while the Ukrainian political leadership was willing to move towards a negotiated settlement earlier in the year, but they were constrained by certain Western allies towards doing that. So I think that's going to be the primary objective, and this is a no-brainer given the fact that they're suffering massively in terms of infrastructure, in terms of lives lost, in terms of their economy suffering hugely. I mean, inflation is at an all-time high in Ukraine. There are food shortages, their energy supplies have been cut off. So up to a certain point, they would be able to sustain that. And of course, by that we mean the public, even though there is huge support for, of course, what they see as the unjust invasion that has been launched upon them by their neighbor. So there is no question of public support, but up to a certain point, they would be able to withstand it. If we look at it in terms of representational geopolitics, I think for Zelensky, President Zelensky, it's very important to continue to maintain the image that Ukraine, the image internationally in terms of the international court of opinion, that Ukraine is the fighting of, it's the sole small rabbit perhaps or something that is actually fighting off the big bag Russian bear. So it's basically a story, a modern day story of David and Goliath. And this is what they're actually, if you even look at, for instance, from very early onwards, since the beginning of the invasion and up to date, if you look at the way that he addresses the public, the way that he dresses, it's all of this is actually part of portraying a larger image. And this is an image that has actually been very much accepted and very much celebrated and supported by the West. There was even talk some months ago of Zelensky being the new Churchill. So standing up to Russian might the same way that Churchill had done earlier. So that's going to be, I think, something that in terms of representational geopolitics particularly they'll be looking at. And then also if we, another thing that I would like to add is that, as we already know, a number of Western allies, European countries, the US, they have pledged support to Ukraine. Europe, for instance, as well has pledged additional long-term loans, loans with no interest and long-term loans. But what Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership, what they're looking to secure is actually grants and not loans. Because for them, the objective is that they do not want, they're already a struggling economy, and then after the war, they will have to focus on rebuilding. So that's going to be a key objective.
That's important. What President Zelensky, in his address to the US Congress yesterday, he made this pitch that this is the money that you are providing is not a charity, it's an investment. So he has made it a case, this is your war that we are going to fight. What's your opinion, Dr. Salik, about the kind of support President Zelensky has got from the United States and now more countries, NATO countries also in the region, they are likely to come up with their support also. How do you see, do they want this to be Afghanistan 2.0 for Russia, or there is going to be a political settlement in the end?
I don't think so. It can be compared with Afghanistan or Vietnam or something. However, the history tells us that there will be much greater international interest as long as the conflict is going on, as happened in case of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But as the conflict comes to an end, it will be seen how much interest can be sustained because of the, it has been mentioned already that the infrastructural damage that has been caused and the damage to the Ukrainian economy that has been caused because of this war, they would probably be need for another Marshall Plan. And would people have the stomach to continue to support that effort, because once the war ends, then the interest will be very different from what they are today.
Do they have the infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. So this will be really a big challenge for Ukraine to build up. What Zelensky was trying to tell that given the example of what happened with Pakistan, we were told number of times that we have given you so many billions of dollars to fight the war against terror, notwithstanding the cost which Pakistan had to pay in terms of lives and in terms of economic reverses. But we were told again and again that we have done a favor to you by giving you some $30+ billion. And I think he's trying to preempt that kind of thing by telling that it is your duty to give it to us, not you are not doing any favor to us. But it is inevitable that now with the Republicans holding majority in the US House of Representatives, there are already some indication that they might put a squeeze on the amount of assistance which is being given to Ukraine because of the domestic political considerations. So that is yet to be seen how that comes into play, because the new Congress is yet not in place.
Yeah, I'll come to Ms. Aiza, to you. What Dr. Salik was saying yesterday, once we were looking at these visuals where President Zelensky was being provided that kind of protocol. So I just recall President Zia during Afghan war and President Musharraf during global war on terror, and also the previous political leadership, Imran Khan, also being given the same kind of protocol. But then what we saw. So what's your take about this?
I think if we look at it, I think the larger question is how long can the US and other Western countries afford to engage in a prolonged conflict? So by all indications, the support that they're providing the Ukrainians, particularly when you look at it in terms of military equipment, so by all indications, it would be to prolong the conflict. But there are a few considerations that we need to keep in mind. So when we look at it from the Europeans' point of view, what they're facing right now are severe energy shortages, particularly important once you realize that winter is setting in and has actually already settled in. When we look at the aid that the EU has pledged to provide, up to date, it has pledged almost $30 billion to the Ukrainians, but there have been gaps, or there have been delays in that coming forward. And for the coming year, they've also pledged an additional $18 billion, which has yet to be, for that they need to take approval of individual countries as well. So while there isn't resistance towards providing this aid to Ukraine, there is in any case hesitation. Keeping in mind also the fact that most of these economies the world over, they're still recovering from the pandemic and the ravages caused by the pandemic. And for Europe, there is the additional cost of the refugees that they are taking in. So there's a refugee cost as well. If you look at it in terms of the US, we've seen the outcome of President Zelensky's visit to Washington, D.C., and also how President Biden has been adamant in his support to Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people. But again, as Dr. Salik also mentioned, it would only happen up to a point, because then you need to take into consideration public opinion as well. We need to keep in view that the US has just gotten out, barely a year out of coming out of Afghanistan, and this is what they are now currently facing. So how much support, how much public support would there really be once the ideals of protecting democratic values and freedom of speech and freedom of expression and supporting, essentially it's all about maintaining the strong image of American global leadership. But even within the public now, there is quite a strong divide as to how necessary that really is.
Yeah. Let's get to the future of NATO. Dr. Salik, how do you see NATO emerging because of these pressures and from the experience of Ukraine? What are the likely pressures on NATO countries and other regional countries to join this alliance?
I think although NATO has grown geographically in Europe due to its eastward expansion, and most recent development is the joining of Finland and Norway in NATO, that has been the development during the course of the Ukraine war. And in fact, if once this conflict ends, even if the Russians are able to achieve their objectives in Ukraine, they'll be much worse off in terms of their security, because Finland traditionally, since the end of the Second World War, the security order which had been developed in Europe, particularly in the Scandinavian region, because of the neutrality of Finland and Norway, that famous process of Finlandization, which came to be known around the world, that is gone now. And now the Russians, if they look at their geography, they have NATO present on their northern borders as well. And to keep coming down, and the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they have been part of NATO now. Then is Poland, and only Belarus and Ukraine were left. And if Ukraine also, as it is after the end of this war, decides to join NATO, then Russia will be almost surrounded on all sides. So from their point of view, it will be a nightmare scenario. I think the least they would like the NATO to accept is that they will let Ukraine remain neutral, although Ukrainians may not like it. But the American, they had already decided to pivot towards Asia Pacific, and their focus was shifting toward this side. I think their recent interest in Europe and in NATO is a short-lived phenomena, and probably this will continue to dissipate after the end of this conflict. Because of the investments they are trying to make in the Asia Pacific region, people are already talking about the Asian NATO, which includes the Quad, including Japan, India, US and Australia, and the AUKUS alliance, where Britain, which had gone back from east of Suez, they have made a comeback in this area, and they have now a naval presence in Asia Pacific, and they are also part of AUKUS. France is also making its presence felt through sending naval ships in this area. So, in the long run, I think the focus will ultimately shift towards Asia Pacific because of the growth of the Chinese influence in this area. Russia, as they have also acknowledged in their national security strategy paper, that it's an immediate threat, but long-term threat is China. So from that point of view, I think this may well be a temporary phenomena, and then the focus will again shift to Asia Pacific.
So you were talking about the U.S. national security strategy, where China remains a major concern. I agree. But everybody expected this conflict to be short in Ukraine. But as we discussed in the very start, this has prolonged and there is no end in sight. So, Aiza, how do you see U.S. interest? Because we saw lots of hype about U.S. Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific strategy and pivot to Asia from Obama era. But suddenly this has happened, and main focus of United States, other Western powers, has moved towards this part of the world. So how do you see this affecting U.S. long-term goals in Asia Pacific?
I think to start off with, it's important to recognize that this is going to divide American interests and where it can put its resources in terms of whether it needs to be focusing on Europe or whether it needs to be focusing on the what they call the Indo-Pacific region now. And I agree with Dr. Salik, as he mentioned earlier, that we've seen in the last several months they've come out with the Indo-Pacific strategy, and then subsequently they came out with the US National Security Strategy document as well in October. And the focus, or at least the long-term focus that they have very clearly stated, is on containing China, where, as Dr. Salik mentioned, Russia is just the immediate threat, while China is the long-term threat because they state it has both the will and the capacity to change the international order which suits the current status quo. So in that sense, I think that it is dividing the resources or the attention that they would wish to put into the Indo-Pacific region. But there are a couple of points which we need to consider as well. So the United States support for Ukraine, in a sense, it's also a test case for US commitment to its allies in the Indo-Pacific region, because the entire idea has been, and even at the start of the war, they had discussed that this is going to be, it's a war against oppression, it's a war against autocratic governments, and in particular this talks about, because when they talk about highly personalized autocratic regimes, they're primarily talking about China and Russia. So providing support to Ukraine, one, it impacts the United States' commitment to its European allies, because this is also about Europe's larger protection and Europe's defense as well. And then it also has an impact on the United States' relationship in the Indo-Pacific region, where it has made a commitment to its allies and where lines are now being drawn effectively as to whether they will side with autocratic regimes like China or whether they will side with those countries that uphold democratic values like the United States. And then also in the broader sense, it also, which we mentioned earlier as well, it does impact US political clout. One of its stated objectives is to renew or to reinvigorate American leadership and to prove, because the world still needs America, and America, this is according to their own strategy documents. So I think it's important for them to not be seen as stepping back in their efforts to support Ukraine, but again, up to a certain point, because the long drawn out conflict would not suit anybody.
Dr. Salik, again, if we go deeper into this, yes, U.S. national security strategy had been emphasizing that China is the primary threat. Now this has happened. How do you think Chinese would be viewing this shift in focus from Indo-Pacific to Ukraine or the Europe of United States? So from a Chinese perspective, is it good?
I think it gives them a temporary reprieve. That pressure probably will ease a bit on the Chinese for the time being once this conflict is going on. But as we have seen, what the Americans are trying to achieve from this conflict is to degrade the Russian power. And the immediate threat which they identified coming from Russia will be actually reduced in its gravity by the time this conflict ends, because Russia will take some time to recover from this, whatever economic and military losses they have suffered in this. And because of that, then they will be able to refocus back on Asia Pacific. But for Chinese, I think the one more lesson is that particularly in the context of Taiwan, they will feel that if there is in future a conflict with Taiwan, the Americans will come on all guns blazing to assist Taiwan, and it will not be easy to overcome Taiwan. They will give them all kinds of weapons, equipment, and maybe even support them with their other resources, military resources. So that would be for Chinese a lesson that the Americans will fulfill their commitments, which they are saying it's not just lip service. If it comes to that, they will probably actively participate in that conflict.
So in a way, Ukraine template is also a signal to the Chinese that if they do something, the West is going to respond in that. Aiza, do you want to say?
I'd like to add something to this as well. I do agree that if we look at it from the Western perspective, then yes, it is absolutely, there's been a lot of talk in the media as well, a lot of opinion articles and a lot of comments, particularly immediately in the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that this might serve as a test case for China and Taiwan as well. If we also look at it from the Chinese perspective, for China, if we go through its national security posture, its defense posture, their defense strategy is primarily a defense strategy, and in a very strong or embedded part of their defense policy, their foreign policy, all of it includes the idea of a benign superpower. So essentially for years and years, the fundamental aspect that they keep emphasizing in their foreign policy and in all other policy matters is that China is not like superpowers that have it's not like traditional superpowers the way that they have behaved. Essentially that China is not a hegemon, it is a benign power. So I think for China it is particularly important they have stated clearly that if it comes to it, then if they are forced to take action over Taiwan, or if they are provoked into taking action over Taiwan, for instance a change in status quo either on part of the Western allies or on part of Taiwan, then they would engage with them militarily if they have to. But their focus remains primarily on peaceful reunification with Taiwan, and for that they are prepared to go the extra mile and to actually wait and do it according to their timeline. So I believe 2049 if we look at that particular year. So that's going to be really important, because for China it's also important that they need to keep global political opinion also on their side as well. And they are very keen not to be seen as going down the traditional route that aggressive or hegemonic superpowers have traditionally taken. But again, if provoked, China would absolutely take action over Taiwan.
So in a way, if this conflict prolongs, it's in the interest of Chinese also, because the focus has shifted from Asia Pacific to the other. Let's come to the other side now. What do you think, Putin, is he achieving anything from this conflict as it prolongs? Is there any gains for President Putin?
I think the longer the conflict continues, it will eat into Russia's economy, and also one thing maybe the Russians learn a useful lesson or two from this. The performance of their military has been seen to be wanting in Ukraine. So they might like to think of reforming and reorganizing their military and trying to remove those weaknesses which they have been very clearly highlighted in this conflict. But because of the sanctions, so far they have been able to continue to sustain this war despite all the sanctions. But the longer it continues, this will start to have an impact on the Russian economy also, and they may have to rethink. But certainly, as I mentioned earlier, because of these two northern neighbors of Russia joining NATO, even if they are able to achieve their objectives in Ukraine, they will be worse off in terms of their overall security situation than before this conflict.
Yeah. Aiza, do you want to say something on that?
I think we can, it's also interesting to look at right when the invasion began. Putin, on the eve of the invasion, he went on media and he addressed the Russian public. And in that, in a very long televised address, and the script was subsequently made available as well, he talked a lot about Russia's red lines being crossed, or Russia repeatedly being provoked into responding in a certain manner. And he particularly pointed out how since the end of the Cold War, in his perception and according to his statements, since the end of the Cold War, he said that Russia has repeatedly been pushed down or the Western powers have repeatedly pushed their knee down onto Russia's neck. And up to a certain point, we have been willing to engage with the Western world, but now this is pushing our limits too far. So we need to be able to show a strong response. So I think in that sense, if at the beginning, if we look at it in terms of other objectives as well, one of his objectives would have been to demonstrate the limits of NATO and of European allies in general support for another European country should it directly be should it enter into conflict with Russia. And then second, also it needs to demonstrate that, and apparently as they seem to be settling in for the long haul, they need to demonstrate that Russia will not be pushed around or provoked. Because if Russia had not responded, if we look at it from their perspective, if they had not responded to this after what happened with Georgia and with NATO creeping ever closer eastward, so for them it was imperative to respond. And if we what are Putin's options? He has started a huge war. Russia has lost major international political clout, and like Dr. Salik mentioned, it cannot continue indefinitely. Even Russian public support, sectors that are supporting the war, even that support would die down eventually. But what are his options? Having started this, he needs to see this through, and ultimately it would appear that the only option would be a negotiated settlement, but it would need to be on Russian terms, or specifically on Putin's terms.
If it happens, the way things are going, these are not very cozy things for President Putin. Now let's see how the regional allies or traditional allies of Russia, they are looking at this, especially once we look towards our region where India has been a very strong strategic partner to Russia. The outcome of this conflict, how it is going to affect the perceptions of Russia's traditional allies, especially I'm talking about India. Dr. Salik.
See, India has always been able to manipulate the differences and conflicts between the global powers. They did it successfully in the Cold War. They were able to benefit from both camps. They have been getting arms and equipment from the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc countries. But then once they had a war with China in 1962, the Americans and the British, they came running to India with piles of military equipment. In fact, before that conflict, India just had 11 infantry divisions. And after the end of that conflict, they were able to raise 11 more. So their military stand doubled after that conflict. But they did not leave Russia. They continued to benefit from Russia. And in 71, as we saw, they signed that famous Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, which was just a name to cover the real intent. In all practical purposes, it was a defense treaty. So they benefited from Soviet Union. And even now, despite the CATSA and other restrictions, India has bought S-400 from Russia, and there have been no sanctions imposed on India. Compare it with Turkey. Once they got such systems from Russia, they faced a lot of rebuke from America and a lot of restrictions. So it hasn't happened in case of India. Then after this conflict, even India decided to purchase cheap Russian oil and grains and all those kind of things, and the West was tolerant of it. They did not react to this, and India very clearly said that to them the primary interest is the interest of their own people, so they will follow that. So they are maintaining that thing. I don't think so India's position in either camp will change, because the stakes are very high. They still get about 50% of the military equipment from Russia, the annual imports, and they're over 70% of their major military platforms are of Russian origin. So they cannot leave Russia, and Russia also has a major interest in maintaining that kind of military relationship with India. And similarly, the Americans, and they need India to counterbalance China, and also it's a big market for them as far as their high technology is concerned, whether it's weapons or whether otherwise the space technology cooperation and in other areas. So I don't think so there will be any difference as far as India is concerned. They will be able to play both camps.
True. There's lots of interdependency also, as Russia is a major supplier to India, lately we have heard news that some of the basic essential items, Russians are asking Indians to produce because of their shortfall. But if we see in terms of how it is going to impact the regional alliances like Quad, the whole purpose of Quad was to contain China. So now the focus has shifted towards Russia and Ukraine. Probably there's less interest for now on Quad. So if this conflict prolongs, Aiza, so do you think there would be less interest by the other Quad partners also? And what is going to be the future of these alliances, Quad and also AUKUS?
I think to start off from the point that we were making earlier with regards to how India has actually very smartly played its position. So India is a major US ally. Proclaimed as a major US ally as well. As you mentioned, it is a member of all these regional alliances. And despite that, it has continued to not just maintain, but I would argue strengthen its relations with Russia even since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that is actually, that is probably, I would suggest, the ideal foreign policy decision-making process, because they are in a position both politically and economically to actually achieve that objective. If we look towards it, if we were to suggest the future of alliances such as Quad and AUKUS, I don't think that they would be in a position to be, or they would be going towards dismantling, or they would be lesser interest, perhaps possibly for the short term. But if you look at it from the lens of America's larger strategy towards the Indo-Pacific region, and again, particularly as laid out very clearly in its national security strategy, in which they also specifically talk about integrated deterrence a great deal in terms of combining their efforts, diplomatic, military, political, economic, technological, otherwise, with all of their allies, especially in this region. So I think in any case, those alliances or those relationships are going to not just continue down that trajectory, they will also strengthen. But leading from this, I would like to add an additional point that when we look at it in terms of, for instance, the West's strategic objectives that it hopes to achieve from this, I think for them, looking at a post-war scenario, it would be very important not to regardless of the general outcome, I think for them it's going to be important not to have a post-war scenario where China and Russia are pushed closer together. And this would then actually depend a great deal on, for instance, if the war does not go in favor of Russia, or if they are brought to a settlement which is not conditional the way that they would like it. The West cannot in any case afford to push Russia too hard or come down too hard on Russia, because then the impact is, of course, beyond the political leadership. It actually goes towards the public. So if a very strong or a very harsh position is taken against them, they do not want to see a closer alliance or a closer standing between China and Russia. Because if we look specifically at the way China has gone forward till now, in the Ukraine conflict, it has while maintaining a position of neutrality and pushing for a negotiated settlement with all parties peacefully, it has in fact at several times pointed out that they completely understand Russia's position and why Russia was, they believe, pushed into the conflict and why Russia took the actions that they did. So there is still that element to it. And then also again, when you look at the strategies of integrated deterrence that are actually believed to be coming out and which apparently would strengthen, it's also going to push China in a particular position. So that's something that they would be interested in looking at.
That's an interesting point. Dr. Salik, let me seek your views also. Do you think that if Russia is pushed too far, China would make its presence felt and provide some kind of support to Russia, or is there a possibility of Russia moving closer to China because of these pressures from the West?
I think we already see signs of these two countries moving together, closer together, because in the just recent days they had held major exercises in the Pacific, which had not happened at that scale before. So as the Americans have been holding joint exercises with South Korea, Japan and other countries in the region, the Russians and the Chinese have been involved in these. But China, as mentioned by Aiza, they kept themselves away from this, did not get involved by way of even providing the much needed arms and equipment to Russia. They have been getting supplies from countries like Iran and others, rather than Chinese providing them anything. But if obviously Chinese also realize that if they're able to force Russia to kneel down, that will ease the pressure on the West, and then they'll be able to focus all their energies against us. So they would like that second pole to remain alive so that their attention remains divided.
Interesting. So, in that context, Aiza, let me get back to you. Do you see any possibility of China-specific military alliances like Quad? Quad is not a military alliance for now, but it has the potential to emerge as a military alliance, or AUKUS, being directed towards Russia, China together, or towards Russia. And if that happens, how India is going to react, because India has its stakes in its partnership with Russia also and United States also. So how do you see that situation? Is there a possibility?
I absolutely think there is a possibility of that happening, of military alliances strengthening and hardening further, particularly the way that things are going. And I would actually go far to suggest that it's actually a matter of time. It's not really a matter of whether, it's probably just a matter of when. From India's perspective, again, India has very strong trade relations with China. India has very strong relations with Russia as well. I think what we need to remember is that you actually cannot change your geography. Neighbors are what you cannot change. So I think that for India, most likely what we would actually see moving forward, and also based on India's history, as was mentioned earlier, during the Cold War, even now with this conflict that we see going on, India is going to maneuver in a position or work in a way that actually serves its interests. Because if we look at it, even for example, if we look at the NATO alliance, the questions that were raised by the European allies were, and this was when NATO was initially formed in 1949. So the question that the European leadership was facing was that ultimately, yes, we have this alliance, but if it comes to a question of protecting New York over, say, Paris or any other European capital, which way would the United States actually swing? So I think that for India, that is sort of the consideration that is actually going to come into play. So alliances are strong and they're upheld, but up to a certain point when the country's own interests are threatened and when it's a question of their survival, I do not think India would have any problem shifting its alliances or staying back and staying neutral when it suits it.
Interesting. And alliances are something that can evolve also.
Absolutely.
Their interests, as their interests change, their targets can also change. So, hypothetically speaking, let's assume the Quad, AUKUS, or some other alliances that could potentially emerge. They start to focus on China, Russia together, the West on one side, China, Russia on the other side. How do you see Pakistan figuring in that kind of environment?
I think Pakistan will have to, as traditionally a country like Pakistan has had to do the tightrope walking at one time between China and United States, and then closer to the region between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And but Pakistan will have to be very, very clever and crafty in following its foreign policy, because I don't think so we have been very, very wise in our conduct during this conflict. Although we maintained neutrality, but then we have been sending contradictory signals as well. So we have to learn from India's experience that your primary objective should be to safeguarding your own interests rather than going closer to one camp or the other.
Great.
If I may add to it,
Aiza.
Pakistan does not seem to be very good at not choosing sides. If we look at our history as well, we've traditionally either been part of one alliance or we've been part of another alliance. And again, developing a more nuanced, a more balanced foreign policy is absolutely a key objective which we need to focus on. But then I would say that it really depends on whether or not, if we look at the question of how Pakistan will move forward in such a situation, I think ultimately it's going to come down to political leadership. And political leadership really needs to, it needs to be a strong leadership, it needs to be a smart, forward-thinking leadership, because we cannot just think in terms of our election cycle. We need to start thinking like other countries which think not decades or 100 or hundreds of years in advance. That is actually what we need to be looking at. Of course, that is in great deal determined by a number of different determinants, including our security, our economy, our people, our public, our external situation in the region that we're in. But again, developing a more nuanced foreign policy is right, because ultimately, if we continue to choose camps, then we will be compromised in one way or another.
Thank you, Dr. Salik and Aiza, for this wonderful discussion. I think your comments were very valuable and insightful, and very important lessons that we can draw from this. this ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia is going to have implications for the global security and also for this region specifically. And Pakistan has to evaluate what are the challenges that it will have to face in the future. And I think from this discussion, there are some valuable lessons. And thank you for watching this segment of Straff Asia, and bye for now.